One woman tried to ruin me by falsifying property lines, weaponizing environmental regulations, and turning my neighbors against me. She didn't know I was a state GIS specialist with access to the very systems she'd corrupted. This isn't just HOA drama. It's a criminal conspiracy I uncovered, and the evidence I gathered sent her to federal prison. What she did next shocked even me. Let me start by telling you a little about myself. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a GIS specialist for the state government. For those who don't know, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems, which means I create and analyze digital maps and property boundaries for a living. Most people see trees, I see coordinates. Most people hear wind, I hear patterns. I love the precision of technology and making sure there's absolute accuracy in boundary surveys and land documentation. It's detail-oriented work that requires a lot of focus, which is exactly why I was looking for a quiet place where I could work from home. But this was about more than just escaping noise. I'd saved for 10 years to escape the clamor of city life. This cabin wasn't just property, it was my sanctuary, the place where I planned to finally heal after my divorce. When Deborah Pierce threatened that, she wasn't just attacking my property lines, she was attacking the last safe place I had left. Even during those first drives out to the countryside, I sometimes noticed a silver SUV idling near the same intersection, always the same one, same spot, engine running. Comment below and tell me if you've ever had that one neighbor who watches you before you even move in. Because I had no idea that Silent Watcher would soon become my worst nightmare. After months of searching online listings and driving through rural areas on weekends, I found what seemed like the perfect property. A sturdy old cabin from the 1950s, all solid oak with that quiet confidence of homes built before shortcuts existed. Its beams carried fingerprints of 3 generations, and the hardwood floors creaked like memory. The best part was its edge of the forest position, where ancient oaks filtered the light into moving gold. I could step outside and hear nothing but wind until one evening, I noticed fresh tire marks pressed into the dirt drive that hadn't been there the day before. Wide, neat, expensive tires. I told myself it was nothing. The cabin had been owned by the same family for 3 generations, and they'd updated all the essentials while keeping its old soul intact. Modern appliances, safe wiring, even high-speed internet, everything I needed for remote work. The price was reasonable too, especially considering how rare genuine solitude has become in today's real estate market. Most listings either cost a fortune or hide some ugly catch. But this one looked spotless. I remember thinking, almost joking to myself, if something feels too perfect, check the boundaries twice. I should have taken my own advice. Since boundary accuracy is literally my profession, I spent weeks meticulously reviewing every piece of documentation related to the property. I pulled historical survey records, checked county zoning maps, and cross-referenced the GIS database to verify that the cabin sat clearly outside any homeowner association boundaries. My lawyer reviewed all the paperwork, and we even hired an independent surveyor to walk the property lines with GPS equipment to confirm there were no discrepancies. Everything checked out perfectly. The property was completely legitimate and definitely not subject to any HOA rules or regulations. The closing process went smoothly, and I was genuinely excited about starting this new chapter of my life. I imagined peaceful mornings with my coffee, working on complex mapping projects while listening to birds singing outside my window instead of traffic and construction noise. During my first few days there, I took walks through the forest preserve and met several neighbors who lived in scattered homes throughout the wooded area. There was an elderly couple who had been there for 40 years, a wildlife photographer who worked for National Geographic, and a retired park ranger who knew every species of tree and bird in the forest. They were all genuinely welcoming and seemed happy to have someone new in the community who appreciated the natural environment as much as they did. But my peaceful introduction to the neighborhood was about to take a dramatic turn. On Saturday morning of my second week, I was sitting on my front porch with coffee, checking emails, and enjoying the sound of wind rustling through the oak trees, when I noticed a woman walking purposefully up my driveway. She moved with the kind of determined stride that suggested this wasn't a casual social visit. Even from a distance, I could tell she was dressed formally, which seemed odd for a weekend morning in a rural area where most people wore hiking boots and casual clothes. When she reached my porch, I got my first good look at Deborah Pierce, and she made quite an impression. She was probably around 50 years old with one of those perfectly styled blonde bob haircuts that looked like she'd just stepped out of an expensive salon. Despite it being Saturday morning, she was wearing a crisp navy blue business suit that probably cost more than most people spend on their entire wardrobe. Her makeup was flawless. Her jewelry was subtle but clearly expensive, and everything about her appearance screamed professional authority and control. She carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room she entered. She introduced herself as Deborah Pierce, president of the Meadowbrook HOA, and asked in a tone that was polite but unmistakably commanding whether I had proper authorization to settle in the area. The way she phrased the question made it sound like I was some kind of squatter rather than a legitimate property owner. I invited her to sit down and explained that my cabin was located outside the HOA boundaries, pulling out the survey documents and property maps to show her the clearly established property lines. I thought providing concrete evidence would clear up any confusion and maybe even lead to a friendly conversation about the neighborhood. Instead of being satisfied with the legal documentation, Deborah seemed even more irritated. She kept asking probing questions about my long-term plans, whether I understood the community standards that she expected everyone in the area to maintain, and how I planned to ensure my property wouldn't negatively impact the surrounding environment. Her tone became increasingly condescending, as if she was speaking to a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of responsible land ownership. I tried to keep things friendly and professional, explaining that I worked for the state government and specialized in exactly this type of property analysis, so I was very confident about the legal status of my land. But the more I talked, the more her expression hardened into something that bordered on hostility. Her smile became forced and artificial, and I could see tension building in her jaw muscles as she clenched her teeth. Finally, she stood up abruptly, looked me straight in the eye with this icy stare that could have frozen water, and said in a voice dripping with barely contained anger, "We'll see about that." She said it like she was auditioning for the role of the main villain in a legal drama. The tone was so dramatic and threatening that part of me wanted to laugh, but something about her body language and the way her hands were clenched into fists told me she was dead serious about whatever she was planning. As I watched her walk back toward the HOA gate with that same hard-edged stride, a chill slipped down my spine. She carried herself like a small-town mayor in her own private kingdom. And the look she threw over her shoulder said, this wasn't finished. The trees around my porch suddenly felt closer, listening. What would you have done? Would you have backed down, or would you have started digging like I did? I had no idea the woman in the navy suit would soon file reports, send letters, and call police over land she didn't own, or that her version of community standards meant war. I told myself she'd calm down once she saw the paperwork. I was wrong. Very wrong. I thought Deborah just needed time to understand legal boundaries. I was completely wrong about that. The first week after my encounter with Deborah was deceptively calm. I settled into my routine, spending mornings analyzing satellite imagery for the State Environmental Department and afternoons exploring forest trails. The work was engaging, and I found myself more productive than I'd been in years. My colleagues noticed the improvement during our weekly video conferences, and I was thinking this move might be the best decision I'd ever made. That piece shattered on Monday morning of my second week. Her campaign of harassment began with a series of escalating attacks. First came the surveillance. I stepped outside to grab my newspaper and found Deborah standing at my property line with expensive photography equipment. She had a high-end digital camera with a telephoto lens and was systematically photographing different angles of my cabin, driveway, and the boundary where my property met the forest preserve. When she noticed me watching, she didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, she gave me a cold nod and continued her work as if I wasn't there. I walked over and asked what she was photographing. She looked up from her viewfinder with that same icy expression and explained that she was conducting an environmental impact assessment for HOA records. According to her, new residents needed monitoring to ensure they weren't damaging the delicate ecosystem. The way she said it made me sound like an environmental threat rather than someone who'd chosen this location to live in harmony with nature. I pointed out that my property wasn't within her HOA's jurisdiction, so whatever assessment she was conducting had no legal authority. Deborah's response was a tight smile as she informed me that environmental protection transcended property lines and responsible community members understood collective stewardship. Her tone was condescending, like she was explaining basic concepts to someone lacking intelligence. I realized this woman had a talent for making reasonable requests sound like threats. Her second move, later that afternoon, was deliberate obstruction. I discovered it when I tried to leave for groceries and found my driveway blocked by a large HOA maintenance truck. The vehicle was positioned so I couldn't back out or turn around. When I investigated, the driver was checking his clipboard with an expression suggesting routine maintenance rather than deliberate obstruction. I asked how long the truck would be there, and he mumbled about tree trimming work that could take several hours. The timing seemed convenient considering I'd never seen HOA maintenance vehicles in the area before, and there were no obvious tree trimming projects visible anywhere. When I mentioned this, he became evasive and said he was following orders about where to park during his lunch break. I took photos of the truck's license plate and position, partly out of habit and partly because the whole situation felt deliberately orchestrated. Her third move was to weaponize bureaucracy. On Wednesday, a formal letter from the city environmental office arrived. The envelope had all the markings of government correspondence, complete with seals and return addresses that looked legitimate. Inside was a complaint form indicating that a concerned citizen had reported potential environmental violations at my property. The allegations included improper wastewater discharge into protected forest areas, unauthorized modifications to natural drainage patterns, and failure to obtain required environmental impact assessments. Reading the complaint felt surreal because every allegation was completely false. My cabin had a properly functioning septic system that had been inspected during purchase. I hadn't modified anything about natural drainage, and there were no environmental impact requirements for living in an existing residence. But the letter required me to respond within 10 business days with evidence proving compliance or face potential fines and enforcement actions. When I opened that environmental complaint letter, my hands shook so badly I could barely read it. This wasn't just harassment. It was someone weaponizing government against me. I realized in that moment, Deborah wasn't just trying to control my property. She was trying to erase me from the map, literally and figuratively. I spent that day gathering paperwork to respond. Fortunately, my technical background meant I knew exactly what evidence would satisfy their requirements. I compiled septic inspection reports, the original environmental assessment, and detailed maps showing my property had no watershed impact. It was tedious work that took hours away from my actual job. That weekend brought a development that made me realize Deborah's campaign was more sophisticated than I'd thought. I was working when I heard vehicles in my driveway and looked out to see a city planning department truck. Two men in government uniforms were walking around my property with measuring equipment and clipboards, taking notes and pointing at different features of my cabin and surrounding landscape. When I went outside, they introduced themselves as city planners conducting a routine survey in response to requests from concerned residents. The older man explained they'd received reports about potential boundary discrepancies and wanted to verify that structures complied with zoning regulations. His manner was courteous but suspicious, as if expecting to find violations rather than conducting a neutral survey. I showed them my property papers and survey records, pointing out everything had been thoroughly verified during purchase. The younger planner seemed satisfied, but the senior officer kept asking probing questions about my future development plans and whether I understood the environmental sensitivities. His questions had an undertone suggesting someone had already given him specific concerns to investigate. The most revealing moment came when the senior planner asked if I'd considered conducting an environmental impact assessment for residential use. When I explained no such assessment was required for occupying an existing residence, he mentioned that a local community leader had expressed concerns about new residents who might not understand their environmental responsibilities. He didn't name Deborah specifically, but his description of a concerned HOA president actively monitoring environmental compliance made it clear who had initiated this visit. After the planners left, I sat on my porch with growing dread. In 2 weeks, I'd gone from enjoying peaceful mornings to dealing with systematic surveillance, blocked driveways, false environmental complaints, and government investigations. The pattern was clear. Deborah wasn't just a controlling neighbor. She was conducting a coordinated campaign to make my life difficult, using environmental concerns as weapons to harass someone she viewed as an unwelcome intruder. I decided to monitor her activities the same way she was monitoring mine. I took photos of her surveillance sessions from my kitchen window, noting times and dates. If she wanted to play games with environmental compliance and government complaints, I could build a record of her harassment for future defense. I had no idea this evidence would become the foundation for exposing a much larger scheme than simple neighbor harassment, but this was just her warm-up for the master plan still to come. I thought I'd won when that environmental complaint was dismissed. For 3 days, the birds sounded normal again. Then I received the county council notice about boundary adjustments and realized she'd just been loading her weapon. An acknowledgement letter arrived, polite and empty, confirming my paperwork was satisfactory. For a few days, I let myself believe Deborah had decided to stop. The mornings felt lighter. Even the birds sounded less suspicious. I should have known better. Someone who weaponizes paperwork never rests. She'd simply moved to the next stage, waiting for the perfect meeting to strike again. The next phase began with an email I almost deleted. A county council notice about boundary adjustments hid among spam and newsletters. Normally, I'd ignore such bureaucracy, but the timing felt too sharp to be coincidence. The subject line mentioned Meadowbrook District Expansion, 2 words that made my stomach tighten. It was written in that smooth language bureaucrats use when they're hiding something important under layers of civic duty. I told myself I was paranoid and clicked anyway. That single click opened the door to her next attack. I went to the meeting in person. The county chamber was half empty, echoing with a fluorescent hum. When Deborah's agenda item came up, she walked to the podium like she owned the oxygen in the room. Navy suit, leather portfolio, rehearsed smile. Her presentation was theater, slides glowing behind her as she preached the urgent need to expand HOA oversight for the sake of environmental protection. Every word landed smoothly, practiced to sound altruistic. I watched the officials nod, mesmerized while she redrew the map of my life, line by line. According to Deborah, the current HOA boundaries were outdated and didn't adequately protect the forest preserve from potential development pressures. She argued that extending HOA authority to include buffer zones around protected areas would ensure consistent standards and prevent irresponsible land use. Her argument sounded reasonable and well-researched, complete with charts and statistics. But as I listened, I realized that her proposed boundary expansion would conveniently include my property and several other parcels currently outside HOA jurisdiction. She was essentially trying to use environmental concerns as legal justification for extending her authority over land that had never been subject to HOA rules. This wasn't just harassment anymore. She was trying to manipulate county government to retroactively force my property under her control. What made the situation even more disturbing was how receptive the council members seemed. They nodded approvingly and asked questions that suggested they were already inclined to support her initiative. It became clear that Deborah had obviously been working behind the scenes to build support long before presenting it publicly. When the floor opened for comments, I stood and introduced myself as a property owner directly affected by the proposal. I kept my tone steady while explaining that retroactively pulling private land into HOA authority violated basic property rights. My cabin, I said, already met every environmental regulation on the books. Deborah's reaction was instant. Her heels clicked as she stepped toward the microphone, cutting me off mid-sentence. "This is exactly the kind of misunderstanding our expansion will prevent," she said, her voice honeyed and sharp. The room murmured approval before I could finish. Twice she interrupted, painting me as reckless and uninformed, the classic troublemaker opposing community safety. I watched my facts dissolve under her charm like ice under hot lights. The council members seemed more interested in Deborah's presentation than my objections, viewing her as a knowledgeable community leader while treating me like a disgruntled property owner simply opposed to reasonable regulations. The meeting ended with the council voting to advance her proposal to the next phase of review. I had 10 business days to respond before the vote. the same amount of time I'd had to respond to that environmental complaint. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief at how smoothly Deborah had manipulated the entire process. She wasn't just harassing me individually anymore. She was using her position to change local laws that would give her legal authority over my property. But Deborah wasn't finished. 2 days later, a man from a company called Green Future Solutions phoned, cheerful in that practice sales tone. He said they were scouting sites for sustainable energy projects and that my property had excellent potential for solar development. My guard went up instantly. I'd never reached out to any energy firm. When I asked how they got my number, he hesitated, then admitted they'd been working with community leadership to identify properties. The phrasing was too smooth, the coincidence too exact. Every instinct screamed this was another hand from the same puppet. I listened politely while he read from his brochure, and somewhere between renewable partnership and green incentives, I realized he was describing Deborah's next revenue stream. When I pressed him about which community leaders had recommended my property, he mentioned that they'd been working closely with the Meadowbrook HOA leadership to identify responsible development opportunities. That confirmed my suspicions. Deborah wasn't just trying to expand HOA boundaries to control my property. She was also working with energy companies to develop the area in ways that would benefit her financially. I told the representative that I wasn't interested in any energy development on my property. He seemed surprised by my refusal and suggested that I might want to reconsider given potential changes in local development regulations. That final comment felt like a veiled threat. The implication was clear. If the HOA boundary expansion went through, I might not have a choice about participating in their plans. I spent the rest of that week researching Green Future Solutions and their connection to local projects. What I discovered was deeply troubling. The company had a pattern of working with HOA organizations to develop properties in environmentally sensitive areas, often using regulatory changes to pressure property owners into agreements they might not otherwise accept. I also started looking more carefully at the financial implications of Deborah's schemes. If she succeeded in expanding HOA boundaries and facilitating energy development, she would benefit from both increased HOA dues from newly included properties and financial partnerships with development companies. Her environmental rhetoric was starting to look like a cover for a sophisticated land grab designed to enrich her. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't just dealing with a controlling neighbor. Deborah was running a complex operation involving county government manipulation, energy company coordination, and using environmental concerns as justification for what was essentially a financial scheme designed to give her control over valuable land around the forest preserve. That was the moment I turned from target to investigator. Using my GIS access, I dug into the boundary archives, chasing a hunch that felt too ugly to ignore. The coordinates stared back at me from my screen, a digital fingerprint of fraud that changed everything. The discovery of those altered coordinates hit me like an electric shock. I sat frozen before the monitor, my reflection ghosted over the map, while the fake boundary lines pulsed back at me. Someone had deliberately edited the digital data for the entire district, nudging coordinates just enough to blur the truth about where HOA control stopped. The precision was terrifying because it looked official, the sort of fraud hidden in plain sight inside government archives. This wasn't an accident or a clerical error. It was design. I spent the next several hours meticulously comparing the altered files with the original survey data I had from my property purchase. The discrepancies were clear once you knew what to look for. Coordinate points had been moved by small increments. Elevation markers had been adjusted, and even some geographic features had been digitally repositioned to support the narrative that current HOA boundaries were inadequate and needed expansion. What made this discovery even more infuriating was the sophistication involved. This wasn't amateur work done by someone who'd watched a few YouTube tutorials. The coordinate modifications showed a deep understanding of GIS systems and cartographic principles. Someone with real expertise had spent considerable time creating these fraudulent maps, knowing that most people wouldn't have the knowledge to detect the alterations. How many other people had she already tricked? How many lives had this woman already destroyed? I started tracing the metadata embedded in the modified files, looking for clues about when and where these changes had been made. The timestamp data revealed that most modifications had been made over the past 6 months, well before I'd even purchased my cabin. The creation dates showed that this operation had been in planning for almost a year. Deborah hadn't started harassing me because of something I'd done. She'd been preparing to manipulate the boundary data long before I ever arrived. I decided to dig deeper by tracing the network access logs and file sharing history. What I discovered made my hands shake as I reached for my coffee. The modified boundary files had been shared through a cloud storage system registered to an environmental consulting company called Ecotech Analytics. I'd never heard of this company before, but a quick internet search revealed disturbing connections. Ecotech Analytics claimed to be a legitimate environmental consulting firm specializing in land use planning. Their website looked polished and featured testimonials from satisfied clients and case studies of successful projects. But when I started looking more carefully at their credentials, red flags began appearing everywhere. The company had been incorporated only 18 months ago, essentially a startup with no long-term track record. The staff profiles featured stock photos rather than actual employee headshots, and the biographical information was vague and generic. Most telling of all, their business address was registered to a virtual office service that provided mail forwarding for companies that didn't actually maintain physical locations. Over the next few days, I dissected everything about Ecotech Analytics, their filings, addresses, and supposed staff. The deeper I dug, the uglier it became. Every impact report they issued conveniently greenlit development that locals had protested. Patterns repeated like fingerprints. Quick approvals, identical language, no genuine ecological data. They weren't consultants, they were rubber stamps wearing green logos. Even more disturbing was the financial trail I uncovered between Ecotech Analytics and Green Future Solutions, the energy company that had contacted me about solar development. Corporate records showed that both companies shared the same registered agent and had been incorporated within weeks of each other. They were essentially shell companies created to provide legitimacy for a coordinated operation to manipulate environmental regulations for financial gain. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and it was much larger than I had initially realized. Deborah wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president trying to expand her authority. She was working with fake environmental consulting companies and energy development firms to create artificial environmental crises that could be solved through profitable development projects. The real gut punch came when the trail of shell companies looped back to a familiar name, Deborah Pierce. Bank ledgers and registration documents listed her as a silent partner in both Ecotech Analytics and Green Future Solutions. She wasn't merely coordinating, she was cashing in. Each forged report, each expanded boundary meant profit wired straight to her disguised accounts. It wasn't about community or environment. It was greed with spreadsheets. The financial projections I found in their internal documents were staggering. If the boundary expansion went through and the energy development projects were approved, Deborah stood to make hundreds of thousands of dollars annually from the operation. The forest preserve area around my cabin was just the beginning. They had identified similar opportunities throughout the county where they could use fake environmental concerns to justify profitable development projects. I realized that my discovery about the coordinate modifications was just the tip of the iceberg. This wasn't just harassment or simple fraud. It was environmental crime on a massive scale involving document forgery, government corruption, and conspiracy to defraud property owners and taxpayers. The woman who had started by photographing my cabin was actually running a criminal enterprise that threatened the integrity of environmental protection throughout our entire region. My job as a state GIS specialist suddenly felt like both a weapon and a target. I had the knowledge to prove the fraud and the credentials to be believed, but one wrong step, and they could erase evidence or turn the accusation back on me. I needed strategy, not anger. Timing would decide whether this became a headline or another buried complaint. As I compiled screenshots and documentation of everything I discovered, I couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. I had originally just wanted to check some coordinate data, but I never expected to end up mapping out an entire criminal conspiracy. I guess when you're trained to spot geographic anomalies, you eventually start noticing other kinds of irregularities, too. I was ready to turn my technical expertise and investigative work into the foundation for bringing down her entire criminal operation. The woman who had tried to destroy my character was about to discover what happened when you targeted someone who had both the skills and the determination to expose systematic fraud. The coordinates had been just the beginning. Now I knew exactly what I was up against. After exposing the scale of Deborah's operation, I believed the worst was behind me. I expected more paperwork, legal wars, complaints, inspections, red tape. What I didn't foresee was how swiftly she'd trade policy for poison. The woman who forged coordinates could just as easily forge character. In hindsight, I should have known that anyone who manipulates systems so easily would find it just as effortless to manipulate people. The first sign of her new offensive appeared on a Monday morning and set my pulse hammering. Every mailbox in the neighborhood had a glossy flyer taped to it screaming "Environmental Danger Alert" in blood red font. It looked terrifyingly official: seals, hazard triangles, government-style formatting. The text warned neighbors about a dangerous forest trespasser accused of harming the ecosystem and threatening safety. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. The photo silhouette was my cabin. The flyer didn't mention my name directly, but the description was unmistakably about me. It described someone who had illegally occupied protected forest land, was conducting unauthorized activities that damaged delicate ecosystems, and had demonstrated aggressive behavior toward concerned community members. The language was carefully crafted to sound like a legitimate safety warning while painting me as an unstable individual. What made the flyer particularly insidious was how it mixed legitimate concerns with completely fabricated allegations. It claimed that unauthorized construction activities on my property were causing soil erosion, that I had been observed dumping chemicals near protected water sources, and that I had verbally threatened residents. None of these accusations were true, but they were detailed enough to sound credible to people who didn't know me personally.
Reading through that flyer felt like being punched in the stomach. Deborah had managed to make me sound like some kind of criminal and community menace, all while positioning herself as a concerned citizen trying to protect the neighborhood. Anyone who received that flyer would naturally want to protect their community from someone who was damaging the environment and behaving aggressively toward neighbors. But Deborah wasn't finished with her character assassination campaign. A few days later, I received a phone call from my supervisor at the State Department. She explained that their office had received several complaints from concerned citizens questioning whether it was appropriate for a state employee to be living in violation of environmental regulations. The complaint suggested that my personal conduct reflected poorly on the department's commitment to environmental integrity, and requested an investigation into my professional fitness. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here I was, a state employee whose job involved protecting environmental integrity, being accused of violations by someone who was actually running a criminal scheme to defraud environmental protection systems. My supervisor was professional about the whole thing, but I could tell that the accusations had raised legitimate concerns about my judgment and character. I took a day off work to sit across from HR, sliding folders of proof across a polished table like evidence in a trial. Every signature, every inspection form felt like begging for innocence. Explaining my private life to coworkers who once trusted me was a quiet humiliation I hadn't prepared for. When they finally cleared me, relief didn't feel like victory, just exhaustion and the sense that something inside my reputation had cracked. The personal attacks escalated further when Deborah convinced local businesses to question their relationships with me. My internet service provider called to verify that I was using their services for legitimate purposes. The propane delivery company explained that they had received reports about potentially dangerous storage practices at my property and needed to conduct an inspection before continuing service. The psychological pressure reached its peak when I discovered that Deborah had escalated her campaign to include suggestions about my mental health and stability. During a conversation with a neighbor who still spoke to me, I learned that Deborah had been telling people that she was concerned about my psychological state and whether I might pose a danger to myself or others. According to her narrative, my isolation and aggressive responses suggested that I was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. She had even suggested that the county should require psychological evaluations for new residents who wanted to live in environmentally sensitive areas. Her argument was that people with certain psychological issues might not be capable of understanding their environmental responsibilities and could pose risks to both the natural habitat and the surrounding community. It was a clever way to pathologize my resistance to her harassment while positioning herself as someone who cared about community mental health. The suggestion that I needed a psychological evaluation hit me harder than any of the other attacks. Being accused of environmental violations or aggressive behavior was frustrating, but questioning my mental stability felt like a fundamental assault on my identity and autonomy. It also made me realize how isolated I had become from the community and how effective Deborah's campaign had been in undermining my social connections. The looks I got from neighbors made me feel like I was being voted off the island. The thought occurred to me as I walked through the local hardware store and noticed how other customers avoided eye contact or moved to different aisles when they saw me approaching. Deborah had succeeded in turning me into a social pariah in my own neighborhood, someone who was viewed with suspicion and concern rather than acceptance and respect. I realized that Deborah's strategy was conducting a systematic campaign to destroy my ability to function normally in my chosen community, making it impossible for me to maintain the peaceful life I had sought when I purchased the cabin. Her goal wasn't just to control my property. It was to force me to abandon my home by making my continued residence psychologically unbearable. That evening, I sat on the porch, staring into the same forest that had once promised peace. The anger still burned, but it hardened into something colder, cleaner. Focus.
The birds kept singing like nothing had changed, but everything had. On the table beside me lay a folder, fat with evidence, her fake assessments, her company filings, the photographs I'd taken from my window. Deborah had crossed from manipulator to saboteur, and in doing so, she'd exposed the weakest part of her design, her ego. Fraud can hide in forms and numbers, but vindictiveness always shows its face. She wanted this to be personal. She'd get her wish. I wasn't the frightened neighbor anymore. I was an analyst with proof, and proof is louder than rumors. It was time to weaponize everything she underestimated: data, patience, and the law. The woman who spent months crafting lies was about to learn what precision feels like when it cuts the other way. This fight would happen on my terms. The next morning, I woke with the kind of focus that feels like ice. Months of fear had burned off overnight, leaving only precision. Deborah thought she'd exhausted me. Instead, she'd trained me. I had what she never counted on: a skill set designed to trace lies and the proof to match. What I lacked before wasn't courage, it was patience. Now, I had both. And patience is lethal when paired with evidence. My first move was to set up environmental sensors, not as a defense, but as a trap. Every measurement became a time-stamped witness. Unofficially, they were my tiny, silent sentinels, recording every trespass and vibration. Each sensor pinged coordinates and timestamps into a cloud backup that even I couldn't alter. As I watched the data stream in, I realized Deborah had made her biggest mistake. She'd given me the perfect opportunity to document her lies in real time. The equipment was commercially available and designed for scientific research, which meant it would hold up to scrutiny from regulatory agencies. Each sensor was GPS coordinated and timestamped, creating a continuous digital record that would be admissible as evidence. The beauty of this approach was that it accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. The monitoring data would prove beyond any doubt that my property had no negative impact on the surrounding forest preserve. It would also capture any trespassing or vandalism attempts by Deborah or her associates. Most importantly, it demonstrated my commitment to environmental stewardship in a way that made her allegations look absurd. While setting up the monitoring network, I also began a systematic digital investigation into the broader scope of Deborah's criminal enterprise. Using my state government access to mapping databases, I started tracing the pattern of fraudulent assessments and boundary manipulations beyond just my immediate area. What I discovered was both shocking and encouraging for my counteroffensive strategy. The Ecotech Analytics shell company had been involved in at least 6 other similar schemes throughout the counties over the past 2 years. In each case, they had provided questionable environmental assessments that supported development projects while claiming to protect sensitive ecological areas. The pattern was always the same: identify valuable land near protected areas, manufacture environmental concerns, then profit from development agreements. More importantly, I found records showing that several property owners in other areas had been subjected to harassment campaigns similar to mine when they resisted these schemes. Two families had been forced to sell their properties after sustained pressure from coordinated complaint campaigns. Another property owner had filed a lawsuit against the county alleging corruption, but the case had been quietly settled out of court. This discovery was crucial because it established that my situation wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of the systematic pattern of criminal activity that targeted multiple victims across the region. This information would be essential for building a case that could expose the entire operation rather than just defending against individual attacks. I reached out to Marcus Chin, a retired county engineer whose name appeared in the old email chains. He'd left the department about 18 months earlier, right when Ecotech Analytics was born. The timing screamed coincidence too loud to ignore. When I finally reached him, his voice carried that mix of caution and relief you hear from people who've waited to tell the truth. I was wondering when someone would finally call, he said. Marcus agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop in the next town over, away from any potential surveillance by Deborah's network. What he told me over the course of 2 hours filled in crucial gaps in my understanding of how the corruption had infiltrated local government. According to Marcus, the scheme had started small with legitimate consulting contracts, but had gradually evolved into a system where predetermined development outcomes were disguised as environmental protection measures. He explained that several county planning officials had been receiving consulting fees from Ecotech Analytics for providing advice on environmental impact assessments. These payments were technically legal because they were structured as independent consulting work. However, the advice always seemed to favor development projects that benefited Ecotech's clients, and the officials involved had voting authority on the very permits they were being paid to influence. Marcus also revealed that he had kept copies of original survey data and correspondence that documented the legitimate boundary information before it was altered. He'd held on to this material as insurance, knowing that someday the fraud would be exposed and he might need to protect himself from accusations of complicity. Now he was willing to provide this documentation to support a criminal investigation. Armed with Marcus's inside information and documentary evidence, I began developing a comprehensive strategy for exposing the entire criminal enterprise. Rather than simply defending against Deborah's attacks, I would go on the offensive by providing law enforcement and regulatory agencies with a complete package that would trigger multiple investigations simultaneously. My plan involved coordinating the disclosure to 3 different agencies to maximize impact. The State Attorney General's office would receive information about the criminal conspiracy and government corruption. The State Environmental Protection Agency would get documentation of the fraudulent assessments and illegal boundary modifications. The FBI would receive details about the interstate nature of the fraud. I spent the next week preparing professional packages for each agency, organizing the documentation to make it easy for investigators to understand the scope and significance of the criminal activity. Each package included timeline analyses, financial trail documentation, technical proof of the coordinate fraud, witness statements from Marcus, and detailed explanations of how the scheme had operated. The most satisfying part of this preparation was creating a comprehensive digital map that showed the actual property boundaries alongside the fraudulent versions that had been used to support Deborah's schemes. Using my GIS software, I was able to create visual presentations that made the coordinate manipulation obvious even to non-technical viewers. As I compiled all this material, I couldn't help but think about how my decision to simply check some coordinate data had led me to uncover a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the radar for years. I wasn't just debugging a system anymore. I was about to expose systematic corruption that had defrauded taxpayers and destroyed the lives of innocent property owners. All my files, maps, and statements were finally aligned. The coordinates of justice were plotted to precision. Deborah, who spent months rewriting truth, was about to face data that refused to lie. My technical knowledge had become the scalpel, and her empire the patient. The irony made me smile. She'd called me a trespasser. Now I was stepping over the lines she forged, lawfully and completely. Everything was in place. Now it was time to spring the trap. The call arrived 3 weeks after I sent the evidence. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit spoke with the calm of someone who already knew the end of the story. My documentation, she said, had triggered a joint investigation across state and federal lines, and they were ready to move. Then she asked the question that froze me mid-breath. Would I stand in the room when the entire conspiracy collapsed? The plan was precise and merciless. Instead of scattering their efforts into separate cases that Deborah could sidestep, the agencies would fuse them into one staged meeting. On paper, it looked like an interagency review, routine and dull. In reality, it would be an ambush in daylight. Deborah had been invited to showcase her latest boundary expansion to a panel she thought was packed with allies. She was walking straight into her own audit. What she didn't know was that the panel would actually consist of federal investigators, state enforcement officers, and county prosecutors who had been briefed on her criminal enterprise. The meeting would serve as both final evidence gathering and a public confrontation that would make it impossible for her to deny her involvement. Agent Martinez explained that my role would be to present the technical evidence of coordinate manipulation to the panel, providing the scientific foundation for the criminal charges. My professional credentials as a state GIS specialist would give weight to the testimony, while my personal experience would demonstrate the human impact of the conspiracy. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at the county building. The irony wasn't lost on me that Deborah would be returning to the scene of her earlier triumph, only to discover that her entire operation had been exposed by the very system she thought she was manipulating. I spent the week refining my presentation and coordinating with other participants. Marcus Chin had agreed to provide testimony about the internal corruption he'd witnessed. 2 other property owners who had been victimized by similar schemes would describe their experiences. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early to set up my equipment. When Deborah arrived, she was dressed in her usual expensive business attire and carried the same leather portfolio. She was accompanied by 2 associates from Ecotech Analytics. None of them seemed to recognize that this meeting was fundamentally different. Agent Martinez opened by introducing the panel members and explaining that this was a special interagency review of environmental protection and land use policies. She mentioned presentations from stakeholders and experts, but didn't immediately reveal the true nature of the proceedings. Deborah took the podium first, gliding into a speech she'd clearly practiced in front of a mirror. Charts flickered behind her, colored bars climbing upward like promises. She spoke of expanded oversight and environmental responsibility, each phrase rolling out as smooth as glass. To an outsider, it looked flawless. But the panel's subtle glances told another story. They recognized fiction wearing the mask of data. Watching her sell lies with such confidence was surreal. She was documenting her own crime live, unaware the audience had already switched from admiration to investigation. Her presentation was polished and professional, but I could see panel members exchanging glances as she made claims about environmental threats they knew were fabricated. She was essentially providing real-time evidence of her fraudulent methodology. When Deborah finished, Agent Martinez thanked her and explained that the panel would now hear from technical experts who had been reviewing the underlying data. That was my cue to begin the presentation that would systematically dismantle her fraudulent scheme. When my turn came, I mirrored her setup. Same projector, same screen, but the story was reversed. I displayed the twin maps. On the left, the authentic survey. On the right, her corrupted version. Points shifted by inches that turned into stolen acres. Elevations warped, streams bent, boundaries redrawn. The visuals spoke louder than I could. Even the least technical eyes in the room saw it instantly. You could almost hear the moment disbelief turned into anger. This wasn't clerical confusion or mapping drift. It was surgery with criminal intent. As I walked through the evidence, I could see Deborah's expression changing from confidence to confusion to growing alarm. She started whispering urgently with her associates, apparently trying to understand how their supposedly secure digital manipulation had been detected so thoroughly. I continued by showing the financial connections between Ecotech Analytics, Green Future Solutions, and the various shell companies used to hide the money flow. Corporate records and banking documentation showed clear coordination patterns between the fake consulting firm, the energy development company, and the county officials receiving consulting fees. The most damning evidence came when I displayed email communications that explicitly discussed strategies for manipulating environmental assessments to support development projects. The language made it clear the participants knew they were engaged in fraud and were coordinating their activities to maximize financial returns while maintaining plausible deniability. Marcus Chin was then called to provide testimony about the internal corruption he'd witnessed. His insider perspective filled in crucial details about how the conspiracy had operated and how legitimate environmental protections had been subverted. When Marcus finished, Agent Martinez addressed Deborah directly, asking if she had any response to the evidence. Deborah's response was indignation and attempted deflection. She claimed the evidence had been misinterpreted, that the financial connections were legitimate business relationships, and that coordination with county officials had been conducted according to proper procedures. Agent Martinez then revealed the true nature of the proceedings by formally identifying herself and the other investigators. She explained that Deborah Pierce, along with her associates and several county officials, were being charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, environmental crimes, corruption of public officials, and federal racketeering offenses. The look on Deborah's face as the scope of the charges was explained was absolutely priceless. If sunlight is the best disinfectant, then today she was getting a full dose of ultraviolet radiation at high noon. The woman who had spent months manipulating regulatory systems and harassing innocent property owners was finally being exposed to the full consequences of her criminal activities. Then the doors opened. Federal marshals stepped in, their boots echoing across the tile. Deborah froze mid-gesture as badges flashed. Within seconds, the woman who once controlled every room was cuffed and silent. Watching her escorted past the projector, where her own fraudulent graph still glowed, was the closest thing to symmetry I'd ever seen. The data she falsified became the proof that convicted her. The skills she dismissed as technical trivia were the blades that cut her empire apart. The noise, the cameras, the chaos, all of it finally settled into quiet. Justice arrived not with anger, but with precision. The harassment was finally over. My reputation was restored, and I could return to the peaceful life I had originally sought. Justice had been served with mathematical precision. The aftermath came like a second storm. Quiet at first, then unstoppable. Within 48 hours, warrants swept through Ecotech Analytics, Green Future Solutions, and the houses of their partners in uniformed chaos. Trucks rolled out with boxes stacked like bricks of consequence. The evidence mountain grew, payment ledgers, secret emails, hard drives coated with falsified maps. Every byte was a confession. Deborah Pierce was formally charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, violations of the Clean Water Act, corruption of public officials, and racketeering under federal RICO statutes. The charges carried a potential sentence of 25 years in federal prison and fines up to $2 million. Her Ecotech Analytics associates faced similar charges, while several county planning officials were indicted for accepting bribes. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once my evidence packages were entered into the court record. Deborah's attorneys initially attempted to challenge the technical evidence, but my professional testimony combined with Marcus Chen's insider knowledge made their position untenable. Within 6 months, plea agreements had been reached with most of the defendants. Deborah held out until the very end, apparently believing that her connections would somehow provide her with a defense strategy. That delusion was shattered when additional victims came forward from 3 neighboring counties who had been subjected to identical schemes involving fake environmental assessments and coordinated harassment campaigns. The pattern evidence was overwhelming and demonstrated that this was a systematic criminal enterprise. The plea agreement came 1 year to the day after she first walked up my driveway. Autumn sunlight hit the courthouse steps as the sentence was read. 12 years federal time, $850,000 in restitution, and a lifetime ban from any land use work. Deborah Pierce, once queen of committees and forests, would now view nature through reinforced glass and barbed wire. The irony was almost poetic, her empire of control ending inside a place ruled by locks. The investigation had exposed systematic corruption within the county planning department that led to a complete overhaul of review processes. New transparency requirements mandated that all environmental assessments be conducted by certified independent firms with no financial connections to development projects. Digital mapping systems were upgraded with automated verification protocols that would detect coordinate manipulations like the ones Deborah had used. Most importantly, the county established a new public-facing digital mapping system that provided open access to all boundary and zoning information. As the state GIS specialist who had uncovered the original fraud, I was invited to consult on the design of this system, ensuring that property owners would never again be vulnerable to the kind of coordinate manipulation that had been used against me. The neighborhood healed slowly, like ground after a fire. For a while, people still avoided eye contact, unsure whether to apologize or pretend nothing happened. Then one afternoon, Mrs. Henderson from down the road appeared with an apple pie and an apology so genuine it caught me off guard. After that, others followed: the retired ranger, the National Geographic photographer, the same faces that once crossed the street to avoid me. Each thank you felt like another boundary corrected, another line restored to truth. The business relationships that had been damaged were quickly restored once the truth became public. My internet service provider sent a personal letter of apology along with a credit for 6 months of free service. The propane delivery company resumed normal service and offered me a discount rate in recognition of the harassment I had endured. My workplace situation improved dramatically. The State Department issued a formal commendation recognizing my role in uncovering a major criminal conspiracy. My supervisor personally apologized and recommended me for a promotion to senior analyst. The department also implemented new whistleblower protection protocols to ensure that employees who reported suspected crimes would be supported. The financial restitution was substantial enough to allow me to make significant improvements to my cabin while maintaining its rustic character. I installed a state-of-the-art environmental monitoring system that would provide ongoing documentation of the ecological health around my property. The data would be automatically shared with university researchers studying forest preserve ecosystems, turning my home into a valuable scientific resource. Perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the transformation of my relationship with the forest preserve itself. What had begun as a peaceful retreat from urban life had become something much more meaningful, a symbol of successful resistance against those who would exploit environmental concerns for personal gain. Every morning when I stepped onto my porch with my coffee, I could see the protected forest that Deborah had tried to manipulate for profit, now permanently secured against future development schemes. The final chapter came 6 months later when I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on environmental crimes and geographic information systems. The presentation I gave about detecting coordinate manipulation became a case study incorporated into training programs for federal investigators and state enforcement officers across multiple agencies. I even heard that some university courses began referencing the case as a real-world example of how local land disputes can uncover far-reaching fraud. Standing at the podium, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had purchased a simple cabin, seeking peace and quiet, never imagining that I would become an accidental activist who helped expose a major criminal conspiracy. What started as a personal dispute over property boundaries evolved into something much bigger, a story about power, deception, and the systems that either fail us or protect us, depending on who's watching. The woman who had once threatened me with her icy stare was now serving time in federal prison, stripped of her title, influence, and carefully curated facade, while I was being recognized as an expert in fraud detection and community integrity. And when the applause faded, I just stood there for a moment, breathing it in. The kind of silence that feels earned. That old cabin with its shaky Wi-Fi had ended up stronger than the empire that tried to crush it. This isn't just about one HOA gone wrong. It's about what happens when we stop questioning the lines that define our lives. The most dangerous boundaries aren't the ones on maps. They're the ones we accept without proof. And that's a lesson I'll never forget. The forest outside my home still looks the same. But now every tree feels like it's watching, remembering, holding pieces of the story in its roots and branches. If you're still here, tell me what you felt about this story and drop a kind word if it hit you. I'm still learning, still building, and every voice helps. So, thanks for being part of it more than you know. We're HOA Unfiltered, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.